So do you have others to join?
I think we've got quorum, so we'll get started, and as folks join, we'll welcome them and go from there. So welcome to the February 8th, 2021 meeting of the Azure Cloud Provider, SIG Cloud Provider Subproject meeting. And we are a part of the Kubernetes community, so let's all be nice to each other by abiding by the CNCF community guidelines. And I pasted the link to the agenda in the chat if you don't have it handy. There are a couple of items on the agenda, and I'll propose we just go down them one by one. The first, does anybody want to volunteer to be a note taker? Actually, since I have less to say about all these things, I'll volunteer to take notes.
I can help if when you're talking.
Sure, that probably won't be a whole lot. So I just wanted to share in this group, and especially for anybody who's listening to the recording, since I think everybody here already knows, but as Andy shared earlier, the Azure file CSI driver has moved to GA. That's great news to have stability in that driver. So I think AKS is going to take advantage of it shortly, and we hope lots of users take advantage of it. Do we have any other news or announcements from anybody else here? Okay, I'll take that as a no.
Yeah, so Azure file has been GA, and Azure disk and blob field driver would be GA after probably this week or after our holiday. So you know that we will start the holiday since this week.
Okay, I'm not aware of that holiday.
Yeah,
welcome, Chi.
Chinese New Year.
Oh, of course, just the biggest one. Shows me how aware I'm being. Gong hei fat choi. Welcome, Chi. Okay, so Pengfei, you probably know best. Have you been asked to prepare a maintainer session for the Azure Cloud Provider for KubeCon EU, or do you know anything about that? I have not seen any communication about that.
No, I didn't get this. So I have actually reviewed some submissions for KubeCon EU, but not holding any session.
Okay. I know that the committee had reduced the number of maintainer sessions.
Yeah.
So it's possible that the Azure Cloud Provider subproject wouldn't have its own. So I'll reach out to Andrew to find out if there is an overall cloud provider one and collaborate with him if it makes sense to include Azure content there. Does that make sense to you?
Okay, so for Azure provider, it's actually not a single SIG anymore. So probably there won't be any such session in the future.
Yeah, so that's something I guess I need to figure out is sort of where should the content that we tend to cover here be shared in those kinds of conferences. Maybe we need to start making a more concerted effort to propose talks, but I'm open to other thoughts about that. Anybody have any ideas around sharing information through the community about progress in cloud provider and drivers and so forth?
I certainly like the idea of just having a standing talk at every KubeCon. We've sort of done that historically with some success, some have been better than others, but just basically having a status update at every KubeCon, I think makes sense.
Okay, so I'll also reach out to the organizers.
This is, sorry.
Go ahead.
This is anecdotal, but in SIG cluster lifecycle, we have like maintainer talks for sub projects since they're so different. So we have like an update for kubeadm and an update for cluster API usually. But they've started asking SIGs to have one talk per SIG, I think. But I think if there's like enough justification to have like different talks for different sub projects, it might make sense to have like an Azure specific one.
Yeah, it's tough because on the cloud provider front, and the northbound API is obviously the same with the other cloud providers. So the southbound is where the differences are, and for most of the community, it's not super relevant. So it's hard to make the argument. But I'll do some investigation in that area. Okay, thanks for the feedback. Any other thoughts on kubectl before we move to the next subject? All right. So the next is an issue that was brought up just today by Jay Voss from VMware, who pointed out an issue that I think is the same issue that we ran into with AKS Engine last week. And that was that the cloud provider broke under certain conditions. I don't know, Jack, I think it links to an issue that you were working on, or that you identified. This is the ELB node label issue. Maybe just who has kind of the best handle on the whole issue?
Go ahead, Cecile.
I can give context. So that specific issue is actually fixed. So this new issue is not about that issue. Thank you, Chief, for pushing the fix. So we only saw the original PR, which caused that issue, but there was a follow-up PR that fixed it. So that issue is good. The issue that Jay opened is more about how can we more generically like ensure that cloud provider supports all flavors of like Kubernetes on Azure, because we're mainly testing it with AKS Engine. And since there's starting to be more and more like different ways to provision Azure clusters, like there's AKS Engine, Cluster API, OpenShift has its own version. There's the Giant Swarm folks who have like a fork of KABZ, which is implementing its own thing. So it would be really great if we could have some sort of, first of all, contract, which like, I think the assumption is that cloud provider isn't going to make any assumptions that aren't made by Azure. So like everything that's in cloud provider should work for like all of Azure. But in some cases, we do have to make specific assumptions. And if those assumptions are made, it would be great if they were documented in a contract so that every provisioning tool can like adhere to that contract and make sure that they're not broken, you know, for doing something that isn't even supposed to be supported by cloud provider. And then the other thing is, how do we test this more consistently? Go ahead, thanks, Wei.
Yes, I think that makes sense. So generally, for cloud provider, it shouldn't make a lot of assumptions across different resources. So for the issue you reported earlier is actually caused by the bug, and that bug is not caught during our engine test, and it has already been fixed now. So it shouldn't have a much issue now. But for the general contract, I think cloud provider indeed have some assumptions for the underlying resource. I think the most important one is all the resources should be inside the same tenant. So we don't support a cross-tenant resource for the cloud provider itself, and also the all the resource, all the virtual machines should be behind either VMTest or VMAS it shouldn't be a standalone virtual machine. I think that's mainly the two assumptions. So for other cases, for the other resource, it should be just work.
So
yeah, and for the entering test, I think we should add more coverage and run some theoretical entering test against the master branch of cloud provider and class API. So I think there are no such entering tests running yet. So we couldn't catch the issues earlier.
Yeah, we have the tests, but they're not PR blocking, and they're only running on releases, not on the master branch. So I think we need to add that. So I think we should talk more about the assumption that you can only have a VM as part of an availability set or a VMSS, because that's actually not true. Historically, that's not been the case. Like, we do this in Cluster API right now, and we use Azure Cloud Provider and it works. So if that's an assumption, that means we could be broken by this assumption. So I think we need to talk about that. But about the contract in general, it'd be great if we documented those so they're not just like hearsay and we have them on paper.
Yeah. Yeah, let's
I
add
think that sounds like the best
section
next
in our
steps.
doc.
So who can take that next step to document this assumption?
Let me add it later, file a new PR.
Okay, so Pengfei, you'll take that?
Yeah.
And I can
And-
certainly
Thank
volunteer
you.
to review and contribute. I'm sure Cecile, not to speak for Cecile, but
Same.
basically we
And-
can all do this as a team.
Yeah, and I'm sure other people who weren't able to join this meeting are also interested, especially like the OpenShift folks and Giant Swarm who aren't, using CABZ per se. So
So we should tag them on the PR.
Yeah. I already tagged it as documentation.
All right, great.
the other thing that would be great to include in this is which resources cloud provider expects to be able to modify, because that it doesn't create. Because right now, AKS and AKS Engine only create the cluster, and then those Azure resources are there, and then you can make any modifications you want. It's not going to, try to reconcile it. Whereas with CABZ, we reconcile the infrastructure in a controller, right? So if cloud provider and CABZ are both trying to modify the same resource, it can cause conflicts. So we need to make sure that everything.
No, I think each write operation should be enforced by some kind of E tag. So if you don't use E tag, then even if not touched by cloud provider, it may cause issues when custom touches them. So
Right.
you should always use E tag when you put the resource.
Exactly. So that's an assumption, or that's like a rule, right? Or contract.
That should be in the contract.
The provisioning tools should let cloud provider over or modify something. So it shouldn't overwrite what cloud provider does.
Yeah, this is very important because I know this has come up in other scenarios, like when people are using Terraform to manage their infrastructure and it gets into a conflict with the cloud provider.
Yeah, I would imagine lots of folks now just sort of painfully go through trial and error, reading through the source code to figure out how to make their DIY solutions work. So we probably make their lives a lot easier if we just basically wrote a how-to guide, how to implement Kubernetes on Azure, and then made those assumptions like actual parts of the contract. So we kept that.
I agree. The how-to guide would be awesome. I think the first step is formalizing this contract about what cloud provider requires itself to own and what's okay for other processes to mutate. Totally. This will be a big step forward. And It was called out by Jay that there was the cap for the semantic versioning policy for external cloud provider. How do we all see this as being consistent or inconsistent with that cap, or just completely not even related to that cap?
So for us, I think we already followed this contract. So for each Kubernetes version, we would release a version of Cloud Controller Manager.
Yeah, I thought.
Right. I think the
That's
larger
where I was
point is
confused.
how do we break so assuming we take the next steps and document the contract that you have to fulfill in order to implement Kubernetes on Azure, we should probably have a plan to sort of how do we purposefully break that contract and then revenue API? I mean, do we do that now? Is it obvious how we do that now? Do we cut a new major version of, say, the SEM or Cloud Controller Manager, or is it more ad hoc?
This is a big hypothetical. I mean, do you have a concrete use case for breaking it? Breaking the contract?
It's not so much breaking it, it's cloud provider adding new requirements. Like any new requirement is breaking, right? Because it's adding a new assumptions that your current users might not follow.
Any expansion of that, as opposed
Right.
to
Or I would say
contraction.
the recent issue that we were tracking that was fixed was actually the introduction of additional validation that didn't used to exist. So you can assume that the cloud provider implementation before that was much more tolerant to say the specific case was the name of the NIC associated with the VM. And so a change was introduced to sort of make the identification of that NIC more deterministic. So, you know, regular expression was introduced to say, look for a NIC that looks like this, but that wasn't there before. And so if someone had been running a successful Azure plus Kubernetes implementation using their own totally hand-rolled infra that named the NIC, you know, my NIC XYZ or something, then that would have suddenly broke. So that kind of stuff is also very interesting.
I think that's the bug we introduced earlier. So generally we shouldn't assume the name for any resource. The only exception is the virtual machine itself. So its a machine name should be same as its host name. I think that's the only assumption for the name. For other resource, the resource name itself shouldn't be make any assumption.
That's another assumption we need to document.
Yes. I think it's also up to PR reviewers to catch those, like, you know, if a PR introduces a new assumption. So if there's a contract, it's easier to like compare the contract and the PR and say, okay, this PR is actually like adding stuff that's not in the contract. So it should either be documented in the contract or not done.
Yeah.
This makes tons of sense. And
so let's review more in the following pull request.
I'm sorry, what I spoke over you, Pengfei. What did you say?
I mean, let's review more on the pull request. So yes. There would be a list of assumptions.
Makes sense.
And I think that, you know, Cecile and I are committed to maybe exerting more resources toward reviewing some of these cloud provider PRs, because I think they probably primarily get reviewed by folks who are AKS first. So in order to represent all of the Kubernetes Azure stakeholders, we should probably spend more time ourselves reviewing from multiple angles. Not that anybody's trying to break anybody else, but that just keeps, I think, everything more honest.
Yeah, and it's better to run some kinds of end-to-end tests. So if Class API would support all kinds of features supported in EKS engine, we could actually switch our pull request ETE to Class API. But I'm not sure whether that is possible. For example, to support basic load balancer, because we see a lot of breaking change from network team recently. So if we couldn't test, then some feature would be broken.
Yeah, that's actually on our roadmap to do that. We have the PR or the tests running in periodic right now in the SIG Azure tab, but they're not running as part of PRs yet.
And maybe I can audit the AKS engine end-to-end test to make. I mean, it's really hard to test, as I'm sure you know, Peng Fei, all the different possibilities of building Kubernetes clusters. But I can audit the way that AKS engine specifically is being tested to see if there's some easy things we can do. Just add a little bit more functionality into the cluster config to get more surface area coverage with the tests that we're already running. That might be an easy win.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other? I think we've exhausted that topic, but I'm happy to hear anything else. If anybody else has anything to add. Okay, so the next topic on the agenda is community meeting time. I put the link to the doodle in the meeting notes, and the summary is that we are bimodal, which isn't really a surprise. We have, well, it's really trimodal, I guess. We have, and it kind of corresponds to where people are. So we have a group of people who are in Europe who prefer early morning Pacific time. And we have a group in Asia who prefer late in the day Pacific time. And then we have our Pacific time folks who prefer slightly less early or slightly less late times. It's not a big surprise. So we had at one time in the past switched to have our meetings kind of alternating between times. And then what happened is that nobody from the Europe time zone ever actually came. And so those meetings ended up being no ops. But I've been getting more, and well, we have had this meeting at this time very rarely, either because I've had issues or because there've been no agenda items, and that was our agreement. If there's no agenda items, we wouldn't have a meeting. And so it's been since October since we've actually held this meeting. So one idea I wanted to raise was just changing the format and scope of the meeting altogether. Should we focus less specifically on Azure Cloud Provider and broaden the scope to more being an office hours about running Kubernetes on Azure in a more general sense? That's one option. Another option would be to switch back to kind of alternating times for Cloud Provider, or even doing both, right? We could, because they may serve different purposes, right? The kind of conversations we have. The problem we have here is that it's just us chickens who work on this stuff, and we don't have any users in this conversation.
Yeah, I think so. So I think we should expand the meeting to more scope to talk about the Kubernetes, the general running Kubernetes on Azure. So this includes the cloud provider, but it should also include some customers to join our meeting.
Do you think that there would be customers in your time zone that would join this meeting?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But if it is holding in US or Europe time, then I think there should be some customers to join.
Yeah, and then we would record it. And would you, because it's very important that you and Chi and Andy are able to, at least get asynchronous communication from that channel, since you're three of the primary contributors.
Yeah. So I think the meeting is actually one of the best way to collect the customer feedback. But the current meeting actually no customer join, so we have no chance to collect them directly.
Yeah.
But the challenge is always time zone.
Yeah. So I think that's, I don't know, Jack seems to agree in the chat, that if we do the alternating, and we have a Europe friendly and a Asia friendly meetings, we'll switch back to that. And then for the Europe friendly one, I might proactively go and recruit some specific users who are active in the provider Azure Slack channel, rather than just doing sort of general announcements. I might reach out to some individually to coax some more participation, because they'll get more out of it if they participate more. And then that way we would meet in this time zone at this kind of time once a month, and then once a month at the European friendly time. Are there any objections to that model?
I would just be careful about being too generic with the scope and ending up becoming an AKS questions hour, or like AKS support in public.
Yeah, I'll work specifically with the GBB team, who has created exactly that already, to make sure that we differentiate from that. So they've created an AKS office hours, and we can even advertise that AKS office hours in our meeting invite to help redirect those people who have AKS specific questions, and therefore at least filter some of that out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
like the CSI announcement from today, that's a perfect general purpose type thing that we would want to keep folks current on every 2 to 4 weeks. That going GA, status of, like, for now, the status of 21, how the release 1.21 is looking from our test signal perspective,
Yeah.
status of Windows, all the various things that folks are kind of working on. It would be nice to be able to announce those, monthly updates and record them so folks can know.
I think that makes a ton of sense. So,
Yeah.
okay, I'll put together some draft communication around exactly that plan, and share it with this audience for a quick review, and then I'll implement the schedule changes in a week so that they show up for the following meeting. Sound good? Awesome.
Yeah, sounds
Okay.
good.
We're at the end of the half hour. Are there any other items anybody wants to bring up in this meeting? Okay, great. Thank you all for being here, and it's great to see you and hear you, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Craig.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you,
Bye.
Craig.